William Thomas Jordan, the guy who calls himself the critical drinker, just uploaded a takedown of Supergirl that manages to be wrong about literally every single thing it touches. And I don't mean subjective taste. I mean factual, verifiable, publicly available information that a 5-second Google search would have corrected. The video calls the lead character an insufferable drunken punk who's too young to be world-weary, they said. It calls the screenwriter a failed actress who aged out of the industry with one credit to her name. It calls the cinematography a smeared chili sauce mess. And people watch this stuff, millions of them, and they walk away thinking they've just heard film criticism. What they've actually heard is a business model. You see, YouTube's algorithm rewards engagement, and nothing generates engagement faster than performative contempt. You shout at a movie for 20 minutes, you throw in a couple of drinking jokes and a cartoonish alter ego, and the platform hands you ad revenue. The guy behind the character, William Thomas Jordan, has turned this into a living. The fact that he has no background in filmmaking, no training in psychology, and no apparent knowledge of theater or cinematography, none of that matters. The grift doesn't require accuracy. It requires volume, sneering, and a character that shields the human behind it from any accountability. That's the whole business. So when Jordan calls Kara Zor-El an unlikable drunken anti-hero and says that a 20-year-old can't realistically be that world-weary, he isn't offering a critique, he's just telling on himself. The film's source material, the Eisner-nominated Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, is explicitly about a genocide survivor. Kara wasn't a baby sent to Earth in a cozy rocket. She was a teenager who watched Argo City disintegrate. She saw her mother die slowly of radiation poisoning and fought a losing battle to save her people before her father sent her away. The director, the writer, the star, and the studio head have all said in interviews publicly available on the record that this is a character with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and deep depression. The screenwriter consulted trauma specialists for this. The actress described her performance as inhibiting someone who numbs herself with alcohol on planets where she has no powers, because feeling human is the only escape from the memories. And that maps onto clinical reality. The DSM-5 criteria for PTSD includes avoidance behaviors like substance abuse, negative alterations in mood like detachment, guilt, and hyperarousal symptoms like irritability and abrasive social interaction. And that's exactly what the drinker mocks as unlikable. The real-world epidemiology backs this up. Studies of Yazidi genocide survivors that found that 97.9% met PTSD criteria. Rwandan youths after the 1994 genocide showed rates of 54% to 62%. A 23-year-old who survived planetary annihilation is not too young to be cynical. She's just statistically typical for what she's been through. Honestly, I think the character might have more insight here into substance abuse than the supposedly critical drinker does. Here's the part that really gives away the grift. The drinker's video calls Anna Nagira, the woman who wrote the screenplay, a failed actress with one micro-budget short to her name. That is not an exaggeration. That is a flat-out lie. It takes maybe 5 seconds to Google out her actual theater career. Anna Nagira is an incredibly accomplished playwright. She won the Elizabeth George Emerging Playwright Commission for her play, Which Way to the Stage, which became a New York Times critic's pick. Her debut play, Empathy Tracks, ran off-Broadway with an 81% audience score and was developed at the Second Stage and the Public Theater. She also co-wrote and starred in the short film We Win, which won Best Screenplay at the Rhode Island Film Festival, and she acted off-Broadway in the acclaimed production of Grief Hotel at the Public Theater. And none of this is hidden. It's right there on the Theatrical Rights website, in her own interviews, and in her resume. On top of that, the institutional timeline proved that her hiring was opposite of the supposed nepotism that the drinker accused her of. She was first hired by Warner Brothers in 2022, long before James Gunn and Peter Safran even ran the studio. When the new leadership rebooted everything in 2024, they retained her because they liked her work. Then they gave her an overall deal and assigned her to write the Wonder Woman reboot and the live-action Teen Titans movie. Studios do not hand overall deals and multiple franchise assignments to failed actresses with no talent. Director Craig Gillespie has said publicly that he was sold on the script after reading just 2 scenes. And James Gunn called it incredible and above and beyond anything he'd hoped for. The Drinker ignores all of this. Either he did no research because of intellectual laziness, or he found it and chose not to mention it because it would destroy the narrative his audience expects. That's just bad faith, and that is the whole product that he's offering. And the script itself is not the cringy Marvel equipped machine that the Drinker describes. Gillespie and Nogueira has both said in separate interviews that the structural model is Charles Portis's True Grit, a hardened, reluctant hero on a road trip with a vengeful young companion. That's a Western. That's a literary classic. The deadpan asides, Kara delivers our roaster Coburn's cantankerousness, not just Whedon banter, which is very far removed from Joss Whedon banter. The younger character, Ruthia, speaks in intentionally archaic, loquacious register. None of this sounds like an MCU movie, but the Drinker cannot tell the difference because his brand doesn't require him to know film history. It requires him to perform outrage for an audience that also doesn't know, and that is a closed loop of mediocrity. Same pattern with a plot. The Drinker says the Green Sun sequence where Kara loses her power and then just gets them back when the yellow sun appears, it's a consequence-free contrivance. That's a Campbellian in Night Sea journey. Do you know what that is? It's the mythological threshold where the hero is stripped of external strength and forced to confront internal demons. She spends 10 hours powerless, defended by a teenage girl, learning to accept help and shed her isolation. When the yellow sun emerges, it coincides with her psychological decision to stop running. The color grade shifts from the saturated green to warm gold. This is visual storytelling. Nothing that the critical Drinker would have understand or know about. Because this is basic narrative theory. You don't need a film degree to recognize a hero rebirth. But you do need to actually engage with the movie or actually watch it instead of scrolling for clips to monetize. And then there's Lobo. The Drinker claims that Lobo is superfluous fan service added in post-production. Lobo was part of Tom King's original comic pitch for the story. Jason Momoa was cast even before filming started. And for the record, post-production happens after filming ends. James Gunn said that the character was integrated to help adapt the story into a 3-act structure. Momoa committed to a non-PG-13 portrayal, and his narrative function is a moral foil. An amoral bounty hunter whose chaotic violence forces Kara to articulate her own ethical limit. The Drinker missed all of this because he wasn't watching the film as it is on the screen. He was just watching it as fuel. And the villain, Cram, that the Drinker calls as a generic villain, that was by design. Cram is an ideological catalyst. This character exists to be so irredeemable that he forces the central conflict. Ruthie wants absolute vengeance, and Kara has to figure out what justice even looks like for someone this monstrous. In the climax, Ruthie spares him, and then Kara executes him with the sword, not out of hatred, but to take on the moral weight so that the kid doesn't have to. That's the complex, uncomfortable ending. It works precisely because Krem is a clear-cut threat and not a misunderstood anti-hero. The Drinker did not understand it because, again, he wasn't there to understand anything. He was just there for the grift. And then the cinematography. The critical Drinker says it looks like someone smeared chili sauce on the lens. Well, the film was shot by Rob Hardy, the BAFTA-winning cinematographer of Ex Machina, Annihilation, and Civil War. The camera was an Arri Alexa 35 with vintage anamorphic lens, deliberately chosen to produce softness, flares, and organic texture. The color workflow ran through ACES and HDR mastering. And so, Hardy's stated philosophy is that light should feel functional and gritty, creating a lived in world instead of the sterile gloss of the corporate blockbusters. The green sun scenes were graded to look nauseating, the yellow sun scenes to feel euphoric. That was not an accident. That's a technician at the top of his field, making intentional aesthetic choices. This is what the drinker's eye is not trained enough to see the difference between a deliberate texture and a mistake, so it just yells ugly and moves on. And the direction that the drinker blames on James Gunnisms? Well, the director is Craig Gillespie. He made I, Tonya, Cruella, Dumb Money. His entire career is built on balancing flawed, abrasive protagonists with dark humor and emotional stakes. James Gunn himself has said publicly that this is a Craig Gillespie film through and through. The soundtrack is punk and blues and not classic rock. Gillespie used changing aspect ratios as a visual motif. He was drawn to the script because of its grit and its focus on worlds and the fringes. And the drinker conflates him with Gunn because to a content mill, all directors are interchangeable targets for the grift. So why does any of this matter? Why spend time dismantling a YouTube video? Because the video is not an isolated opinion. It is an engine that converts misinformation into money. William Thomas Jordan has built a career by misinterpreting deliberate creative choices as failures, omitting publicly available facts that contradicts his narrative, and hiding behind a cartoonish character to shield himself from the consequences of attacking real artists by name. He calls an acclaimed playwright a failed actress. He calls a clinically accurate trauma survivor insufferable. He has no training, no relevant credentials, and no discernible curiosity about the medium he claims to critique. It's a persona, a monetization strategy, and a fan base that rewards laziness. Drop the critical, just drinker. That's the honest label. The film that the drinker attempted to destroy is a psychologically authentic, professionally crafted, narratively structured, and visually intentional work. It adapts an Eisner-nominated comic with fidelity and care. It features a lead performance grounded in clinical trauma research. It's written by a decorated playwright hired through a transparent merit-based process. It was shot by a master cinematographer using state-of-the-art equipment to achieve a deliberate anti-corporate aesthetic. It was directed by an author with a proven track record of making emotionally complex films about difficult protagonists. The man shouting at it is an unoriginal grifter whose entire output is a monument to bad faith, and the algorithm keeps paying him anyway. Subscribe.